Kathy had a question.
Tara, I really appreciate everybody's time. This was from back at slide 7. This is probably very, as a structural engineer, very simplistic question to you geotechnical engineering geniuses. I was just wondering, did you see any correlation with the soil saturation with the optimal moisture content? Because I do remember there's an optimal moisture content for maximizing the packing factor when it's
Kathy, I believe your question was for John, correct?
Yes. Is he still around?
Yes.
Yep, I'm here.
Yes, we're here. Just wanted to clarify. Yeah, I saw your question.
Yes. So the thing I'm more looking at is like if you start with a given initial water content, what would the changes be? So for our sand specimens, they're basically tamped and not necessarily compacted. Sands usually have a relatively flat compaction curve, as opposed to the clays where you have a mountain-shaped curve where you could have different soil structures if you're on the left or right of this optimal value. So I think for sands, this initial soil structure is probably not as big of an issue due to compaction, and it's probably what the initial water content is that's going to be more important. If that answers your question.
I think I'm just trying to bring it more to what my real life interaction with my actual clients are. I mean, I'm trying to see what your research actually means to practicing structural engineers like me.
Sure. Yeah, so because the curve is flat for a sand, you're really not going to have an optimal moisture content for these materials. If you did start to try to expand this work into more clay soils, I think that there are some other challenges that you would need to look into there. Clays usually don't have as much large of the open air voids where you could have seismic compression. So I think, yeah. Interesting though.
Thank you, Kathy.
All right, there's a question from Eduardo Miranda in the chat as well.
Yep, I saw that. I think this question is for Jeff. Jeff, Eduardo is asking, you talk about the SSI, the classical SSI work of Meek and Beletzos, and he points out the importance of radiation damping on structural response. And he's asking, how do we reproduce this energy dissipation in the bucket of the centrifuge test?
Actually, Eduardo has the microphone access. So
excuse me.
If you want to phrase it
Express
in your own words.
Tara just read it. So that was the main thing. My concern is especially with the bottom of the bucket.
Yeah. So I scanned through that slide fairly quickly with our laminar container dimensions, but I want to say it's about 200 millimeters deep, and then our footing is an inch or 25 millimeters, and it's embedded that same distance beneath the surface. So there's, let me think, there's almost 8 footing embedment depths beneath it in the container. And then we also maintained about 2 footing lengths and widths to the plant area, to the edge of the laminar container, just kind of based on classical bearing capacity theory. So we did think about, the space needed inside that small laminar container and, size the footing down. I'm not, it's definitely not my strongest suit, but with 8 embedment depths beneath it, I think that should be sufficient to, accommodate that radiation damping.
But if you compute the time that of travel time of these waves during the test, you will see that they will basically bounce back and forth. I mean, up and down during the test, and that's a little bit of a concern.
I see. Gotcha.
Yeah, I think Eduardo's right. It's a clear challenge in a small scale centrifuge experiment. Perhaps if I could enrich the discussion a bit, it's humbling at least that the intent here is a consistent cross comparison with different improvement strategies. So arguably, are you're doing your level best to minimize that impact of the boundary effects, but they're quite similar to an extent from test to test, where you're hopefully just varying as a control, varying ground improvement strategies. So, and I think Jeff had a slide of the scope of the centrifuge program in the beginning, the thought being that empty bucket compared with, soil only bucket compared with soil with improvement strategy 1, and then soil with the footing, the footing structural mass, soil with the footing structural mass with the improvement, and then several different improvement strategies, horizontal versus vertical elements. And those are sized fairly small. So the hope is that the cross comparison across these different tests will elicit some interest in and understanding of the impact. Clearly, the better situation would be to move towards full scale tests, but these are pretty readily and easily constructed. Jeff can do these pretty quickly, so that's nice. If folks have other questions, could maybe type them in the chat or raise your hand. We still have a couple more minutes for our presenters. I'll ask a question of Farzin then. I was very interested in the volume, the impressive volume of simulations that you're performing. I'm curious how long these simulations are taking to run for you. You mentioned that you're hoping for some improvements in the pipeline in OpenSeas, but what are you looking at in terms of computational time to complete some of these simulations?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for asking that important question. Each simulation of these bridges takes about 2-3 minutes. But you have to rotate ground motions every 10 degrees.
Right.
Now, something that we have recently realized through some unfortunate means is that OpenSea's convergence criteria, or the loop that you have for convergence, sometimes gives you a wrong answer, converges around the wrong point.
Jeff is shaking his head, yeah.
Yeah, catching that is an art. And we are right now working on that topic to make sure that what we do is correct. I have spot checked our current results. Again, from what I've looked at, I don't see any problem in this work, but there was another work that while we were checking, we realized that, oops, there was stuff that we were missing. So there was one thing that is the volume of the runs. It takes time, and we're using high performance computing to take care of that. Mm-hmm. But even if you have done all these runs, you need to have some sanity check to make sure that your runs are accurate. And for example, I'm going to use this ruler. Imagine that the horizontal axis is the theta that you're applying the ground motion. You expect to see a form of response like this. That as you increase the theta,
you reach the apex,
in the response, and then you have a drop. You might start with an off phase that you start here, but then later on you're going to go up. Now, you should be able to see that trend because nature is always differentiable. You wouldn't have this plot going up and then suddenly a spike up and then drop down. It doesn't happen that way. Unless again, you cannot say never, because if you see such a thing, you need to go and dig and find out if truly at that one angle of the application of the ground motion, something unnatural happens onto your structure that you get that form of a spike. Other than that, you should usually have a very smooth response. Now, again, this is a area that we're trying to figure out what we need to do. I've discussed with a couple of folks who are online today. So we're working on it.
Are you in a
But
position where you can dismiss some of those results? You can have a criteria to dismiss some of these results
Yes.
and obviously understand what, you know, what you've had to dismiss because you keep track of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But then if you dismiss, you have to, it's all about the efficiency of your runs, because this means you have
Right.
to spend the resources, and this is kind of a hitting you on two sides. One, you spend the resources to get the wrong result, and you were unable to use these resources to get the good result.
Of course, yeah, and you're missing some waiting
missing
region.
something,
Yeah, yeah. So that needs some engineering judgment in the end and interpretation of the results. Yeah. Yeah.
So all of this brings me down to I want to have this conversation with folks that are there ways to make OpenSeas work more efficiently. I have seen that OpenSeas the program is changed to work on GPU, but there's only one paper that I found that they have this system of equations to work on the GPU rather than the CPU. Now, I asked this question from Sylvia and others, that what is a good machine that we need to go and buy that can do OpenSeas in the most efficient way? Should we spend more resources on CPU? Should we more resources on RAM? What are the bottlenecks in this whole entire simulation process? And I hope that I can get answered when we get to the OpenSeas discussion. And I know these are very trivial items for many people. It's not for me. I take responsibility for not knowing some of the stuff, but I have these questions.
I had one thought about that. I'm not sure if it is exactly applicable to your case, but I made my test tolerance relatively tight. And then if it ever does have a convergence issue, I have some code that relaxes it a little bit for that individual time step. And that's been working pretty well for me to prevent it from converging around a weird individual step. Just having a tight tolerance for almost all the steps, but then relaxing it just in case.
Sure. Jeff, makes total sense. Two things here. Number one is tightening the tolerance basically means longer runtime.
Yeah.
And then once you relax the tolerance a little bit, it might shoot the structure in a zone of behavior that is not kosher. So basically, this thing is doing something somewhere that it shouldn't be. And then
It's a little more complicated with the million degrees of freedom that Farzin has. That's the issue.
And then I'm going to borrow something that I discussed this with Eduardo, and Eduardo can chime in once he sees fit, is that there is a difference between converging on an element level and then converging at the system level. And you might get off on an element level that might be trivial. You relax there and you basically lose a battle but win the war.
I see.
Yeah, I'll just say that it's particularly critical where you have some sort of like bifurcation, either on the soil because of a failure in soil or because of tipping over in case of your structures, Jeff.
They're very sensitive to the transition between those two mechanisms as well.
But Jeff, if you have more thoughts, I will be very happy to discuss this. I like to get input from anyone possible.
Great, Farzin.
Yeah, me too. Any collaboration on the OpenSeas front will help me a lot.
I'll send you an email, my friend.
Great. Thanks.
I don't see any more questions within the chat box or the Q&A, and I think we've been a successful session and reached our time to 10 o'clock to allow for a break. So I'll yield the closure to Amarnath. Thank you so much to each of our presenters and for the questions and healthy discussion at the conclusion.